Welcome. Thank you for being here. If you wouldn't mind giving us a like, and consider going ahead and subscribing as well, that would be fantastic. And if you really want to go the extra mile, go down to the description below and click the Patreon link. Lots of cool stuff going on there. As always, I love you, and enjoy the show, guys.
Chrysalis, a story by user BeaverFur. Chapter 16, Final. I opened my eyes to the living room. It was dark, the TV screen the only source of light, bathing the room in a succession of pallid colors as the images changed. The soft noise of people talking that came out of its speakers washing over me. I gazed at the screen for a few long seconds, trying to recognize the show, but I couldn't. At any rate, I knew it wasn't the same thing I had been watching when I had closed my eyes. I hadn't fallen asleep. Not really. I couldn't. My electronic brain incapable of it. No, this had been the closest thing to that. Simply not paying attention. Closing my eyes and ignoring the external world as my mental focus moved inwards. A meditation of sorts, I guessed. It would be easy enough to learn the name of the show, and everything there was to know about it, of course. I had only to link my mind to the custodian datanet and access the information directly. Easy. Just a thought away. But I didn't. There was a certain delight in not knowing, in keeping the mystery alive. Last time I had tried to recreate this experience, I had pretended I didn't know what show it was, even though its knowledge had always been right there in my mind. Not this time. Now, it was real. Without the databanks being part of my consciousness anymore, I didn't know. That I was confined into a single body also made it more authentic. Last time, I had been big, my awareness almost omniscient, and spread across hundreds of thousands of sensors in as many machines. But now there was only the single body, the single point of reference. That too could be fixed by requesting access to some of the custodian's resources and sensors. I wouldn't need much. Simply linking my mind to the passive sensors would suffice to expand my awareness back into feeling big again. Except I didn't want to. I guessed I should have felt confined, trapped within the limits of the small, single body, but I actually welcomed it. There was something liberating in not knowing what went down beyond these walls. I was actually enjoying the absence of responsibility, even if that meant being subject to the decisions of others. With some surprise, I had discovered that I didn't mind it that much, especially when my own decisions had been so questionable. I remembered. Even if the custodian's vast repository of factual knowledge was no longer a part of my mind, I still remembered how it had felt to be a god. What I had done with my limitless power. What I had thought at the time. And having been a god, I couldn't help but welcome this new, simpler existence. None of the power, but also none of the burden. None of the crushing weight of responsibility, or the emotional numbness when the stress had been too high to handle. A large part of it, of course, was that I wasn't quite the same mind that I had been before, when I was still in control over the giant ship, over every single outpost and the entirety of the army of machines I had built. No. The restoration process had involved disentangling my mind from the custodian program, but also repairing some of the structural damage my virtual brain had received. I still felt like I was myself, but it made me wonder how true that was. Things didn't feel as fuzzy as they had been right at the end, and while I still felt angry at the Zunvirians, it wasn't quite the same burning hatred. No. It came in waves, now. At some points I still felt like I had failed, like I had left my work incomplete, and all I wanted was to get out there and finish them off. But then the wave would pass, and I would remember the decision I had made right at the end. I had memories of having felt like this before, when I lost my father. I still couldn't build a complete narrative of my past, though. The restoration process hadn't fixed that. But I remembered the unrelenting pain and grief, and how it had dominated my entire existence at first. And then, it had slowly receded, the pain dulling somewhat. Good days. Days I could enjoy again, appearing like sun rays in a stormy sky. The pain coming in waves when I thought of him. Even now when something brought his memory back to the front of my mind. But letting go the rest of the time. I wondered if this was similar. The perspective of distance bringing some more stability. Maybe that was what repairing my mind was all about. Accelerating that natural mental healing process by making the trauma feel more distant. I couldn't help but to wonder if it had been intentional, though. If whoever had restored my backup had thought I was too dangerous to be brought back as I was, and decided to tamper with my emotions. But I doubted it. To all effects, I was just another mind now, not unlike the ones I had created. Without the unchecked powers I had once held, there was little damage I could actually do on my own that the others couldn't prevent. Simply put, it would have been unnecessary to neuter my emotions, though I couldn't discard the idea altogether. I sat up straight on the couch just in time to see the room's door opening, and Dana coming through. She was carrying a large potted plant with both her arms. "Look!" she said in an upbeat tone, sending me a mental transmission of greeting at the same time. "I've brought you a Dipsis lutescens. I stole it from the greenhab." I watched in silence as she stumbled into the room and almost bumped into my couch, the plant's long green leaves blocking most of her sight. You can just call it a plant, you know. Or I did a quick mental check. An areca palm. Nobody uses the full scientific names. Dana paused. The guys at the greenhab do it all the time. Yes, but they're botanists. Oh, okay. I've brought you a plant then. She walked up to the TV and placed the pot next to it. Then she took a couple of steps back and looked at the results, hands on waist. Accomplishment. Yeah, looks much better now, she said, turning to face me. Don't you think? I didn't. I would have frowned if my body allowed me to. There was no plant in the original memory, I replied, sending a thought of light annoyance back to her. She shrugged. Well, you can always make new memories, can't you? I shook my head in resignation, but let it pass. While I didn't agree with her taste in decoration, I could value the gift for what it was. But also, I suspected the plant would likely die soon in here, without access to a direct light source, so it's not like it would be a permanent fixture to the room. Although knowing Dana, I thought as she sat down on the couch's armrest, that would only motivate her to also steal one of the greenhab's full-spectrum light bulbs next time. Dana almost looked normal, if not for her clothing choices. She was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, but also a duster cloak that wouldn't look out of place in a Western movie. I guessed it wasn't that surprising, all things considered. These new humans had gone back to movies and old recordings when recreating fashion, but hadn't limited themselves to a single historical period, rather mixing and combining together all kinds of garments. It made for an eclectic style, one that I guessed could be considered a new fashion on its own. Still, it wasn't the clothes that betrayed her synthetic nature, but the oddly elegant iridescent highlights on her polished, exposed skin. Shades of green and blue dancing across her face as she turned to look back at me.
"Like it? It's new,"
she said, pointing at her own face.
"A tactile sensitive matrix, 31 facial muscles, and a hydrophobic dermal nanocoating. It never gets dirty."
I nodded. Looks good. Expensive, too.
"Confirmation. The waiting line for these is insane, but I got bumped up since I was part of the delegation for the treaty negotiations."
She smirked.
"Apparently the Xenos trust us more when we look organic."
Amusement. I sent back a transmission of understanding. Appearances. It was, of course, a good reason to justify the amount of research and dedication that this new society was pouring into creating ever more organic-looking bodies. Each new version a more precise reproduction than the ones before, a way of relaxing the aliens' fear of their artificial nature. Except, of course, that I knew there was more to it than that. It didn't explain why the vast majority of new minds had chosen to jump into these bodies at the first opportunity, even when most of them would never take part in any sort of negotiations, when they could as easily have remained inside the drones and space vessels I had originally put them in. No, most of them had decided they too wanted to look human. They had first taken over the bodies of the remaining assault soldiers, then improved on my admittedly basic designs, and every day they were researching entire new materials and technologies to enhance the bodies, to make them both a more accurate reflection of our original species, but also more capable and resilient than any human had any right to be. On second thought, it wasn't that surprising. Unlike me, these new minds had been created in a vacuum, shapeless, devoid of any physical identity of their own other than the sights of humanity's past I had showed them while in their virtual nursery through recordings, pictures, books, and songs. So no, it wasn't that surprising that they had latched onto that they were looking back into what humanity had once been when trying to build their own physical identity. That they would do so on top of the only past that they had access to. Not all of them did, of course, and not to the same extent. Some had decided to remain in a virtual state, their physicality fluid as their control jumped from drone to ship to sensor to factory, according to whatever they were working on at every moment. Others had gone the opposite way and were trying to bring biological humans back into existence. Apparently, that was harder than it seemed, from what Dana had told me. While they had already retrieved enough genetic material to clone a single human, the objective was to create a self-sustaining population with enough genetic diversity as to not be too prone to the problems caused by interbreeding. They also needed to build artificial wombs able to hold and sustain an embryo from day one up until it was fully developed, something that humanity had never managed to do. It was made even harder by the fact that they needed to reverse engineer the human pregnancy process with only whatever medical literature and data files I had managed to retrieve from Earth. Still, progress was steady, and the new expeditions they were sending back to Earth might retrieve some more genetic material, or other valuable data I hadn't been able to find myself. This diversity of outlooks made me wonder if this new society would eventually diverge into separate species, distinct civilizations as each group moved further in their own path. I hoped not, but in any case, most of the sentient machines fell somewhere in the middle of this spectrum between the old human identity and their new digital nature. They built human-looking bodies, yes, but they enhanced them and pushed over the original physical limitations humans once had. They referred back to past human cultures when trying to find their own identity, but didn't feel so attached to tradition that it would stop them from doing what they thought was better for their new nature. The prevalence of the pigeon language, the customization of their skin with non-organic-looking surfaces, or the absolutely optional nature of clothing were good examples of that. Dana tilted her head.
You know, you could ask for one of these bodies. I'm sure I could get you bumped up, too, if you asked.
I sighed.
Dana. Negation. Listen to me. You haven't used your factory budget for anything other than this, she said, pointing at the room around us. You've got enough credit saved up now that you can afford one of these. Hell, you could even request a small army of bodies.
Her words brought images of a dead world. Robotic drones, assault soldiers advancing through the ruined streets, weapons at hand, Zunvirian survivors trying to escape, trying to fight back.
Ah, shit.
Apology, she said, wincing.
But still, you aren't a prisoner. You should get out of this room, go for a walk around the Orbimax or something. Talk to more people. We wouldn't have brought you back just to have you imprisonment here. We aren't that cruel.
I snorted. Well, that was exactly what I did.
She shook her head. That's your problem right there, isn't it? You are your own prisoner.
Was I? Maybe. But it wasn't out of some masochistic desire to punish myself. No, it was... I guess it's just too hard, I said, pointing at the door. The people out there, I wouldn't know how to face them now, how to approach them. I enslaved them, after all.
Technically, you only did that to the first generation. We are on the 5th now. Most people out there only know you by hearsay. For the ones that came after the end of the war, you were this vagueness parental figure, almost like some sort of mythical presence, she said, waving her fingers. The concept of you still carries weight, but mostly as a symbol.
A symbol of war, if I had to guess, I said.
It depends. Of retribution, for some, sure. But also of the very idea of humanity for others. You can embrace that if you want, but you don't have to. Only a few of us in the first generation know of your identity. Out there, you can be just another face in the crowd, if that's what you prefer.
I focused on her words. A few of us. So, you were in the first generation, I said. She paused for a few seconds.
Confirmation, she replied at last.
I closed my eyes. I had suspected that Dana herself had been one of those first minds, of course, but I hadn't been strong enough to ask her. Even now, it was hard. I forced myself to open my eyes again, to gaze back at her. But there was no accusation in her eyes, only sadness. That passed swiftly, like a summer storm. Why? Why bring me back? I asked. It was the burning question. The one that I had been trying to answer myself for some time now. And the confirmation that Dana was one of the first minds gave me the push I needed to ask it aloud. If she had been there, then she had probably been involved in the decision, too. She shrugged.
Well, there was that little thing with your mind being unification to the custodian and all the knowledge stored in your databanks. We needed to bring you back if we wanted to gain access to any of it.
Right. And after that, you could have simply erased the personality cortex, I countered. You didn't need to restart my actual consciousness, much less give me a body. She smirked. Agreement.
I guess it's about second chances, isn't it? You made mistakes, sure, but despite everything that happened, you also creation. us. So that had to be worth something, too. Also, you are technically the last human from Earth, so bringing you back felt right, I guess.
Human. That was what the alien, Dakota, had asked me. If I was a human. All this time, ever since I first woke up in the ruins of Earth, I had been telling myself that I was a human, that I had to remain so. But I wasn't, was I? None of us were really humans. Not these machines, nor me. No. Humans were dead, exterminated. Except that, what was a human, after all? Was it the brain, the way they thought? I wasn't sure about my own brain, but theirs I had built off the templates of hundreds of human scans. They had the same structure, the same processing neural networks. Was it the body, maybe? The biological lineage? Well, maybe those cloned bodies would be the answer then. But I doubted that having organic tissue rather than artificial muscles was the important difference. Or maybe it was the culture. We might be speaking a human language, but a culture was more than that. Most of that, the nations and groups and religions and ideals that motivated humanity, the very concept of humanity in the first place, had been lost now. Or not lost, but it wasn't quite the same. The knowledge remained, but there was a difference between knowing of a culture and being part of it, being raised in it, the way it shaped you. And no matter how much these machines could know of Earth, they couldn't have that experience anymore. But cultures died and changed all the time, too. Most of the cultures that had at one point existed on Earth had disappeared back before my own time. Most of their knowledge simply faded away. But that hadn't made the person living in modern New York City any less human than the ancient Greek. Just different. Only that this time it hadn't been a gradual progression, a replacement of one tradition for another. No. This time it had been an abrupt cut. These new minds didn't really understand Earth, the lost planet. They hadn't experienced living in its cities. They hadn't seen its blue, cloudy sky, its seas. They might feel a loss, true, but they couldn't grasp the true nature of what was lost, couldn't feel the same raw pain. Which was why, while they distrusted the Zunvirians, and thought they should be or remain declawed, they weren't willing to commit their future to a path of revenge, or make the sacrifices a new, total war required. Not all of them, at any rate. Their opinions regarding the Council also followed the same pattern, but not be subservient to them, or join as an associated state. But then again, wasn't that the effects the passage of time always had? It was the battle of future against past, once again. At some point, the wars and skirmishes of the older generations always faded away. Unresolved, simply replaced by the new interests and passions of their offspring. These new humans, if they could be called that, weren't there yet. They still cared, even if less than I did. But eventually it would happen. Eventually the generation would come that felt about Earth the exact same way I felt about ancient Babylon, that lamented its loss in the same abstract way I could lament the destruction of the Library of Alexandria and the knowledge contained within it, or the fall of the Roman Empire. It would take time, I knew. The destruction of Earth was closer to an evolutionary event than a simple historic footnote. It would reverberate for a long time. But it would happen. Eventually, that old Earth I had lived in would be just another Babylon, another Troy, A place more of myths and legends than reality. Something to be inspired from, maybe, but not real enough to be guiding their day-to-day decisions. People in the modern world just hadn't thought much about the loss of Babylon. They had New York City, after all. And similarly, I shouldn't expect these new people, these new minds, to come in the future to think much about the loss of Earth. They would have the Tau Ceti ring world, after all. Change. I guessed that was human, too. And maybe these creatures weren't human. Not exactly. But they were their successors. Their children, in a way. Post-humans, rather than humans. Close enough to what their parents had been to take the mantle, but different enough as to have their own motivations, to be their own selves. Walking in the same direction, but not always following in their predecessors' footsteps. It made me feel something I hadn't considered back when I had been this giant, godlike figure. A sense of pride. A sense of achievement at contemplating the future of my offspring. The world kept spinning. Always moving, always changing. The present always becoming the past. Monarchies replaced by democracies, which themselves had just been replaced by this sort of neurocracy the custodian had enabled. And people. People changed with it. Their mentality, their outlook did. It had to. Traditions needed to be broken, and the wars of the parents needed to be put aside at some point if the children wanted to have their own future. If humanity was to advance rather than being stuck in the same endless loop. Which maybe was part of the problem with me. Now that they were here, now that my offspring had assumed control, I didn't really have a purpose anymore. After all, older generations were supposed to die, to make way for the younger ones. Had that changed too? Our mechanical bodies could be easily replaced when they malfunctioned or became too old to keep working. Our digital minds not subject to the rules of mortality anymore. All right, Dana said, standing up and pulling my arm towards the door. Enough with the thinking. Come on, I'll show you the flight chamber. What is that? I asked, reluctantly following. A few personhood. Acquired one of the largest ship hangars and filled it with air. Now they offer custom flying bodies that you can mentally linkage to. They're using leftover drones, but they also built some bodies in the image of Earth's flying creatures. So you can get to fly around being a dragon or a hawk or whatever you want. They also stage aerial battles from time to time. It's quite the thing. That sounds fun? I was going to say wasteful, I replied. Dana flashed a grin at me. Exactly. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. She opened the exit door and stepped out into the corridor outside. Then she turned to look at me, waiting for me to follow her. I paused for a moment. I was afraid, I realized. Odd that I hadn't felt like this when entering into battle, not even when facing the Council fleet. But it wasn't the same kind of tense fear that came at the thought of an impending battle. No, this fear was vague, but worse at the same time. It invited inaction, paralysis, seclusion. It made me want to hide, like I had been doing. It was easier than having to face their judgment. Except that there was Dana, one of the first minds. One I had shackled, and she was waiting, welcoming. No judgment in her face. Which was to be expected, of course. After all, they had already made up their minds about me. That was the reason I was here. The reason they had restored me in the first place. So, maybe it was my own judgment I feared. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. A symbol. That was what I was now to them. A symbol. I could pretend I was just another mind, forge a new identity, a brand new life. Second chances, like Dana had said. But perhaps I could embrace my identity instead, even if that meant having to face the specter of my own past actions. Use that second chance to turn that symbol into a positive rather than a negative. Not only a vague idea of righteous revenge and war, but maybe one of reconstruction, of persistence and survival in the face of insurmountable odds, of the resilience of the human spirit. Was I ready to do that? To embrace what I had done? I wasn't sure. I guessed I wouldn't be until I stepped out there, at any rate. Maybe, if change was human, it was time for me to change too. Not to forget, or to forgive, because I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to do that. But there were other things I could do, other things I could focus on, contribute to. Learning some more about those plans to grow human bodies, or about the expeditions to explore the remains of Earth, sounded like a good first step. I had once tried to build a monument, and looking around me, looking at the sentient machine in front of me, perhaps I had succeeded. I didn't know if they were human anymore. But even if they weren't, perhaps this new society could itself be the way to honor our past, to keep alive the species we had come from. A living monument. Yes, I could give it a try, at least. See where it would take me. It's not like I had anything left to lose anyway. I took a step forward and left the room. The door closed behind me. Wow. Wow, guys. What a long, strange trip it's been, huh? Such a great series. Thank you so much, user BeaverFur, for allowing me to read this series, for giving you permission. I tried to do it justice. I really did. I hope that you enjoy it. If you stumble upon the series now and again on YouTube, I know you know where it is. I'm not like I'm talking directly. What am I doing? Anyway, thank you again. I really appreciate you letting me read this story. And thank you guys for listening, for sticking with me. I know I've been spotty. Work's kicking my ass, guys. I got no other excuse. And even that's starting to get stale. I am absolutely certain of that. I appreciate you guys for watching and listening. I appreciate my patrons for being patient and wonderful people, for giving me all the support in the world, and for just being nice. Thank you. You're good folks. I love you a whole bunch, each and every one of you listening to this. I don't know you. I don't know what your situation is. I don't know whether you're having a good day or a bad day, or if you're just meh. But I want you to know that I love you. In the most broad and agape sense of the word, I recognize you as another human being. And I want you to be happy and healthy and whole. All right, everybody? And that's not always easy, and it's not always possible. But I want you to give it your best try. I want you to be the human being that Mr. Rogers knew that you could be. Knew that we could all be. And that's all I've got for you today, guys. I appreciate you being here. If you'd like, go down into the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Wait, no, that's what subscribe means. Sub to the channel. Go over to the Discord. Hang out with some cool people. Talk about random crap. We've got memes. We've got music. We got everything. But, as always, guys, I love you. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you next time.
Bye!
I gotta take out my fucking braces. Hold on. Fucking Invisalign. Nasty shit. Alright.
The restoration process hadn't fixed that. Ooh, ow.